Good afternoon. I'm J.D. Gordon, a senior fellow with the Center for a Secure Free Society. Thank you for coming today. While we wait for Senator Cruz, I'll introduce SFS and tell you a little bit more about what we're doing these days. The Center for a Secure Free Society is a DC-based national security think tank focused on transnational threats in the Western Hemisphere. Our mission is to discover, develop, and support a global network of security scholars and practitioners advancing freedom and security worldwide. Given the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, it's important to understand the global dimensions of the conflict and the role of specific extra-regional actors. To that end, I would like to introduce our VRIC monitor, which is the latest product from the Center for a Secure Free Society. The VRIC monitor covers what it seems to suggest in the title, the VRIC. We came up with this, VRIC, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China, based loosely off of what people talk about the BRIC, which was Brazil, Russia, India and China being an economic bloc. So we thought that it would be interesting to talk about the VRIC in terms of a security and intelligence type of cooperation, if not an actual alliance. There's nothing on paper that says there is this formal alliance, although these four countries do work together on security and intelligence cooperation. So the VRIC monitor is our latest product. Venezuela, of course, is the lead country for the Bolivarian Revolution. It's a collection of Latin American countries that want to change the world order, if you will. And they were formally represented by an ALBA alliance, which was a formal alliance to challenge the United States and our allies, our free market allies in the Western Hemisphere. Iran, of course, is also on a revolution. It is the Iranian Revolution starting in 1979, and their goal is to export revolutionary Islam. And in that goal, it's an extremist form of Islam, a Shia Islam. And what they try to do is they're essentially conducting terrorism around the globe. They're a state sponsor of terror. They challenge the United States and our allies, specifically Saudi Arabia, specifically Israel. Iran's threatened multiple times to wipe Israel off the map. Well, Iran's working in Venezuela as well, specifically through the presence of Hezbollah. But Iran's leadership has been visiting Venezuela. They've had a strong amount of ties with Venezuela. And the Iranians have actually trained some of these Venezuelan thugs on colectivos, these motorcycle gangs that assassinate protesters, peaceful protesters, similar to what we've seen in Iran during the Green Revolution. We all remember in 2009 where the girl Neda was shot in the throat from a sniper from the Iranian paramilitaries. Well, the Iranian paramilitaries wanted to do and are successfully achieving the same type of thing in Venezuela, to train the paramilitaries to kill innocent civilians. Russia, of course, as the senator alluded to, has been a top weapons supplier to Venezuela. That's not new. That's been going on for a while. I remember when I was a Pentagon spokesman from 2005 to 2009, we were very concerned with all the AK-47s, the 100,000 AK-47s that the Russians were supplying to the Venezuelans. And those AK-47s were meant for a type of counter-revolution. In case Hugo Chavez would fall, the Russians armed the Venezuelan militias, essentially, to be able to stage a counter-revolution. So Russia's had quite a negative role in freedom, in suppressing freedom in Venezuela for some time. China, of course, China, as the senator also alluded to, has been financing Venezuela, the top financer. China has been engaged in floating billions of dollars worth of loans to Venezuela to keep the Maduro regime afloat, and before that, to keep the Hugo Chavez government afloat. So basically what China has bought with that is they've bought loyalty, they've bought friendship from the Venezuelan government, and the Venezuelan government has systematically oppressed the people, like we're seeing today. It's very timely that we're also talking about this today in light of the interim president Juan Guaido's launch of Operation Libertad. And Operación Libertad just kicked off. There will be massive street protests tomorrow as well. There's already been some clashes today. The Vice President and the Secretary of State have already tweeted out support just today, this morning, for Juan Guaido and the movement he's trying to lead to restore a democratic country to Venezuela, to restore freedom to Venezuela. Because as we see the model of Venezuela, socialism does kill. And while we're still waiting for Senator Cruz, let me take this opportunity to introduce the panelists that we have today. We have 3 panelists and a moderator. Our first panelist, he'll come up in a little bit after Senator Cruz is done, is Joseph Humeyer, who's the Executive Director of the Center for a Secure Free Society. Joseph is at the forefront of field research in Latin America and has been for over the past decade. Joseph was also a Marine veteran. He served in Iraq, combat veteran. And he just returned from a month-long trip in Colombia and Brazil where he met with senior government officials and military leaders. Welcome back, Joseph. Claire Lopez, who is a past colleague of mine from the Center for Security Policy. She's still there. Claire Lopez is the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy. Claire was a CIA case officer stationed in Venezuela during the early 1990s. In fact, Claire was in Venezuela during the first coup attempt by Hugo Chavez in February of 1992. So Claire, it's great to have your expertise here as well. Matt Zweig, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's a former senior staffer at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, working for Chairman Ed Royce, and he worked a lot on Iran, Venezuela, and Russia sanctions. So Matt, it's a pleasure to have your expertise here today as well. And our moderator is Lauren Meyer from the Washington Times. She had a couple excellent stories recently, citing Secretary Pompeo and his alarm that he was sounding about the extra-regional actors in Venezuela. It's not just Cuba. A lot of people talk about the tens of thousands of security and intelligence agents in Cuba that have been in Venezuela, but it's also, as the senator alluded to, it's also Russia, it's also China, also Iran, hence the BRIC. Before she was at the Washington Times, Lauren was at CNN for 4 years and also at Axios. So it's great to have you here today, Lauren. Thank you very much for being our moderator. Now we can welcome our panel up to the front, please. Joseph Humeyer, Claire Lopez, Matt Zweig, and Lauren Meyer, our moderator.
All right. So first and foremost, thank you to the Center for a Secure and Free Society. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who is here at this event today. So right off the bat, I want to start with our panelists with the news of the day. Juan Guaido, who has been widely recognized as the interim president of Venezuela, announced this morning he is beginning the final phase of Operation Freedom, Operation Libertad. The move quickly received an outpouring of support from U.S. leaders, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Vice President Mike Pence, and Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan. Meanwhile, Maduro's government has denounced this move and called it a coup d'etat. Can I quickly go down the line and get each of your reactions to this latest news and what you see Russia, Iran, or China's response to these latest events may be? Matthew, maybe we could start with you.
My apologies. Thank you. When it comes to Russia and China's response to these events, you've largely seen not necessarily the Chinese, but the Russians take a much more active approach with respect to an asymmetric, kind of an asymmetric response, comparable to what they've done in eastern Ukraine and Syria. I'd imagine they'd be pulling from a similar playbook in terms of increasing resources and increasing activities related to Venezuela. And at that point, you would likely see an administration response more or less playing from the strengths of our playbook where it comes to economic and diplomatic pressure.
I think this day is a pivotal day, as you heard Senators Grassley and Cruz both say. The thing to keep in mind is that the regime of Nicolas Maduro has had a very long time to prepare for this day. They knew this day would come. They knew that sanctions would not be the end of the opposition to Maduro's continued regime. And so we have heard talk about the tens of thousands, perhaps 20,000, perhaps 30,000 Cubans security services, intelligence, and others in Venezuela to prop up that regime. We know as well that both Russia and China have sent at least advisors over the last number of weeks. We know as well that the Iranian regime has been deeply embedded in the Maduro regime with its intelligence, MOIS, Ministry of Intelligence and Security Forces, as well as the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and its division, the Quds Force, as well. And think also, in addition to that, that there are Hezbollah representatives, operatives inside of Venezuela. We'll get more into detail, I'm sure, as we go along about what the Hezbollah presence means for Venezuela, South America, and us. But there are many forces, is what I'm saying, that are there available to Maduro to prop him up, whether or not his own forces, the Guardia Nacional or the army itself, remain loyal or don't. So it's a pivotal moment. I don't know, we don't know which way this will go today, but just realize that this could be a very long, hard fight, and this could today just be the beginning of it.
Well, first, Lauren, thank you for being with us, and thank you to our other speakers. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I'm going to echo a little bit of what Claire said, but I want to be very careful how I say it, because today is an important day, and today is one of those days that, had I known that today was going to be today, I might have scheduled this event another day, because this is a day that we really need to support Guaido and his government. They are in the fight of their lives. They need the tremendous amount of international support. They also need, obviously, the military to support them as well. And they've been working on this for a tremendously long time. This has been kind of the D-Day for them in terms of since he took office in January 23rd, 2019. With that, let me say that I think we also have to be prepared that if this doesn't work, right? If we don't have mass military defections at the scale that it tips the balance of power so that Guaido can be moved into a transitional government and we move to free and fair elections, at least the way the strategy goes. If that does not happen, we need to have what some have called like a plan E or a plan F, kind of biting off of what President Trump said during his press conference with President Duque of Colombia. And that alternative plan or that contingency plan needs to have a perspective on the military that maybe that the military is not the most critical factor in this equation. Let's build this as an analogous to another institution in Venezuela, PDVSA. PDVSA is a failed institution in the country that even if we were to move to a transition in Venezuela, we couldn't just turn the spigot on and they're going to start producing petroleum the way they were in the 1990s. The institution is broken, it has been purged, it has been corrupted, and has been criminalized. If we can appreciate that about a major institution, state institution such as PDVSA, we should be able to appreciate that about the military as well. Very similar symptoms have taken place in the military where it's been purged, corrupted, criminalized, to the point that, and this is for the people that are veterans here, would understand, they are not combat ready. Meaning they do not have combat effectiveness. You do not just put on a uniform, pick up a rifle, and go to a combat zone. There's several tests, there's several measures that are taken in what's called a workup to make sure that you're ready for combat operations. And the Venezuelan military, they're very good, this is their moment right now to show their political power, but they do not have military power in any kind of conventional sense. And so in that sense, what will happen if, my outlook of what would happen if, even if the entire military goes behind President Guaido, is I see a civil war scenario in which they will clash with an array of irregular forces, as Claire was mentioning, that has been prepared for this specific moment. Chavez knew that this day would come, and they prepared for a moment where they would clash with their own Venezuelan armed forces. And I believe that day is getting closer by the minute.
So perfect spot to jump off here. Claire, I'm going to go back to you. You've raised questions in the past over whether the Venezuelan military would remain loyal to Nicolas Maduro. Considering that there appeared to be indications that the military was about to abandon Maduro in recent months, with the latest news coming out of Venezuela today. And there were clearly hopes within the Trump administration, notably by John Bolton, who has appeared on cable news, suggesting that it was just a matter of time before the senior officer corps of the Venezuelan military would abandon Maduro. Can you talk to us a bit about this now, coming off again of the news of the day? And can you give us a sense of why this still hasn't happened on an even larger scale?
The kind of revolution that you're seeing in Venezuela is very much a slow rolling event. Until and unless the senior ranks of the Venezuelan military, as well as its own Guardia Nacional and intelligence service, others, are convinced that the tide has shifted, the tide has turned against the regime, they're not going to risk themselves, their families, their futures, their lives. They have to be convinced that this is really going to happen. Now, today does seem to be a pivotal point. It's a turning point. But what we don't know yet, and I've heard Joseph talk about this as well, is even were those senior ranks or many more of the officer corps of the Venezuelan army to turn against Maduro and declare for Guaido, you've still got to deal with those other forces in the country, the Cubans, intelligence and security services. You've got to deal with Hezbollah, and believe me, they're trained. And you've got to deal with the ranks of the Iranians in country, which, as I said, include intelligence forces, MOIS, as well as IRGC and Quds Force. Now, will the point come when Maduro would unleash those forces, those foreign forces, to defend himself if he thought that his own military were not up to the job or had turned? So, I mean, there's so much yet that we don't know in terms of the way this is going to go that I really have to, I guess, caution too much enthusiasm just about today. There's a long ways to go yet. And it will be very important not only about the Venezuelan military, but also these foreign forces. Do they get involved? Does Maduro unleash them? And are they willing to back Maduro in a physical and a violent way against the people in the streets?
Excellent. And just a quick follow-up for you here. What more specifically would it take for a full transition to take place from the Venezuelan military forces to transition their loyalties from Maduro to Guaido?
I think what I said towards the beginning there a few minutes ago, they would have to be convinced that this is really going to happen. They have to be convinced that Maduro really is going to fall, that Guaido really has enough forces on his side. And how do you gauge that when you're a captain, a major, a colonel even in the military force? How do you gauge who will stand with you and who will not? When your entire military is penetrated, your entire military ranks are penetrated by Cuban intelligence, whom do you speak to? Whom do you talk to? Whom do you seek to ally with you to see if there is a enough force to be confident that the tide will turn? This is what, I mean, put yourself in the places of those military officers and rank and file too. Right now, this is what's going through their heads. Will the Cubans be unleashed? Will they begin shooting people in the military, not just in the streets? There's a great deal of calculation going on in the minds of the Venezuelan military today, their officer ranks, and their intelligence services, and the Guardia Nacional as well. I think they don't know, and they've been kept deliberately in a position in which they cannot calculate, or they cannot meet, group, assess, how many might be with them, not with them, with Maduro, not with Maduro. That is the job. That is the job that the Cuban intelligence services have been doing, to keep them each separated, unsure of themselves or of their allies, if there are any. So I guess in a long way of saying, there's probably a lot of calculation going on and a lot of confusion about which way to go today. And as I said, I don't think this will be over today. I think this is the beginning of a long, tough slog.
Joseph, did you want to follow up on Claire's point?
Sure. Just to add a little bit of context to the kind of the incentives that the military needs to be able to make that transition over to Guaido. I think a little context in the sense there's a long history of distrust between the military and the political actors in the country. There's been a lot of backstabbing, a lot of failed commitments by political actors in this kind of commitment to the Venezuelan armed forces, and vice versa. The Venezuelan armed forces repeatedly also have promised they would do things. They didn't live up to those promises, and so there's this aura of distrust among these actors, and I think that's important to emphasize as we see, because I think what the Venezuelan military, and I've spoken to some of these individuals myself, and what I sense is what they're looking for is some type of credible commitment from the opposition that this is not just them, that the United States is going to back them, that the international community is going to back them, that there is a credible show of force that will allow the cards to be stacked in their favor, so that if they were to act against the regime, that they would win. They definitely don't want to do this just to be able to be another segment of the political prisoner population in the Venezuelan jails. But with that, I want to add one thing, and that's I think there's a lot of words that have been used to describe the Venezuelan government or describe the power structure in Venezuela. And I think in this sense, it's very important, particularly here in Congress, because words matter and words have effects in terms of budgets and authorities. And so the most popular term that you've probably heard when it comes to describing the Venezuelan power structure is a narco state, right? And I believe that's largely true, mostly true. However, it's incomplete. And in fact, it has very damaging consequences when you try to look at it from a national security optic, because when you look at a narco state, what you're looking essentially as narco trafficking being the center of gravity of a conflict. And in that sense, when it comes to congressional oversight, you have budgets and authorities, so you allocate those budgets and authorities accordingly to the agencies that deal with narcotics, DEA being at the forefront. Even the Department of Defense, Southern Command, which is the military combatant command in charge of South America, Latin America, about 40–50% of their budgets is dedicated to interdiction operations and anti-narcotic operations and supplements of the drug trafficking flows from Latin America. And more recently, you've heard probably the mafia state, which is, I think, is an extension of that criminal element, but you're kind of broadening out to not just be narcotics, mining, money laundering, illegal gold, or whatever, just to broaden out that this is a criminalized regime. But I don't think those terms are correct. Criminals do not start wars. Criminals look for power. Criminals look for control. Criminals look to buy out territory and governments. Criminals really just want to be left alone so that they can do criminal stuff. This is a regime that has a goal. This is a regime that has a revolutionary aspiration and has an end state. And within that, the concept that we're using at the center to describe the regime is what you see up there. I don't see if the term's up there, but it's called a parallel state. It's an academic concept that's been derived from Robert Paxton, an American historian, who has used it to describe Nazi Germany, actually. And when a sub-state structure is created that uses totalitarian measures to capture the government, then uses the government to capture society, and then uses the society to destabilize the region. Obviously, that was what happened in World War II during the Nazi Germany, but this has happened repeated time and again. It was also used to describe the fascists in Italy, and more recently, it's been used ironically by Erdogan in Turkey to describe the Golan movement. That said, I believe that what we see in Venezuela is a sub-state structure, which I've called a civic paramilitary criminal structure, to where you see geographic regions in Venezuela divided and controlled by local politicians, criminal actors, and paramilitary elements. And I believe that's the real power structure of Venezuela. Until you understand that structure, any type of military action is going to be futile, because you don't know what are the levers that you need to push to be able to dismantle the regime.
So shifting gears here just a bit, Matthew, in the last several decades, financial and economic sanctions have become a key tool of U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration has made particularly heavy use of this tool, especially with Iran and Russia recently, with its targeting of Russian financial industries. A report released by a Cuban human rights group earlier this month concluded that relying exclusively on economic sanctions will not end international meddling in Venezuela. Do you agree with this conclusions, or will sanctions actually spark regime change? And if not, what do you believe would be an effective tool in this specific situation?
Well, thank you very much. Sanctions in the absence of an overall, sanctions are a tool. Sanctions are not a strategy. So the role that sanctions play, either as a primary or a secondary instrument of exerting national power, it's important to view that instrument within the overall paradigm and the overall construct of the utilization of other elements of national economic power. Sanctions alone won't solve a problem, but sanctions can be an effective deterrent when it comes to what you're essentially seeing in Venezuela between Iran and I'd actually use Iran and Hezbollah in the same sentence. I wouldn't separate the two in terms of their global footprint and their global operations, but with respect to Russia, Iran, China, Cuba, and Venezuela, you're seeing kind of a rogue state convergence in the same manner that our sanctions regimes need to be flexible, and I think that particular overlap, particularly the intelligence and defense sectors as it relates to Venezuela, you also have a fairly substantial overlap of risk related to Russia-specific sanctions, related to Iran-specific sanctions, related to Venezuela-specific sanctions, related to Cuba-specific sanctions, related to Nicaragua-specific sanctions, et cetera. So one of the things that the administration needs to do is that it needs to look at that general nexus and that general network and figure out how best to leverage sanctions as an economic tool to increase the risk and and lower the risk appetite for those rogue actors.
So if there were to be regime change, what do you believe that we can expect from Juan Guaido, who has denounced Russia's intervention, in taking steps to distance Russia's involvement in the country?
Well, I don't think Guaido would necessarily want to expose himself to the same level of risk that Maduro currently is. One of the variables that's frequently overlooked when it comes to Venezuela sanctions, when people look at Venezuela, they generally look at Venezuela in the context of what the administration is doing under Venezuela's sanctions authorities. You have some very, very substantial, what are called secondary sanctions on Russia, specifically that have been levied on Russia, specifically with respect to their defense and intelligence sectors, and anybody transacting in those sectors. That incurs a certain level of risk for the incoming Guaido government, who would obviously be looking for some sort of economic boost that would, in my opinion, effectively dissuade them from doing any type of business with Russia beyond the defense and intelligence sectors.
So sticking with Russia here just a bit, Claire, maybe you can answer this question. As Senator Cruz mentioned, Russia is a prominent arms sponsor to Venezuela. So if Venezuela does transition to a government under Guaido, what do you believe would happen to the relationship between Russia and Venezuela and subsequently the country's arms supply?
Well, I think certainly you're going to see quite a shift once the Guaido effort succeeds, which we all are hoping that it does. That relationship with Russia and other rogues, if we think about it, which are the regimes in the world that are supporting Maduro? They're the rogue regimes, right? They're the other totalitarian regimes. It's totalitarian regimes stick together, hang together, or we're all going to hang separately, right? So once the transition actually does happen, and we're certainly hoping that it does, I think you will see a shift. Remember, there are many, many dozens of countries, including the United States, Canada, many countries of South America, of Latin America, of the Western European countries and elsewhere, who already, since January, have openly, firmly stated their support for Guaido. So he will not lack for support once the transition hopefully concludes and results in his ability to lead the nation with Maduro and his thugs out. They are not going to need Russia, Cuba, Iran, Turkey, perhaps China. Let's leave that one to the side because that has many implications, ramifications that go beyond simply the military or propping up a rogue regime like they have right now in Caracas. But for the others, I think that Juan Guaido can count on an immediate support coming from many of the nations that have already declared their support for him. And I think he would dispense rather readily and happily of the kind of support that the likes of the Russian, Iranian, Turkish, or other regimes are providing right now. Cuban.
Great, thank you. So in another area of discussion, Joseph, you've posed the argument before that Venezuela could be seen as a state sponsor of terrorism. Can you make the case for that here, and do you see yourself changing this argument if Guaido were to be formally recognized as the nationwide leader?
Yeah, sure. So that's interesting question in the sense that I was actually asked this by the elements of the administration in November of last year. So yes, I have been on record. There's videos of me making an argument as to why Venezuela would have been listed as the state sponsor of terror, but those were several years ago. So let me be very direct in how I say this. Does Venezuela sponsor terrorist groups, including ELN, including groups like Hezbollah? Absolutely, yes, they do. On merit, there is plenty in abundance of evidence that they provided all kinds of logistical support to these groups, including using their immigration services to give fully formed cover identities and cover platforms to some of these operatives from other parts of or outside the country and other parts of the world. That said, when I was asked this in November of last year, I was asked this, and if you guys remember, there was, I think, a Washington Post article or something that was leaked that talked about the potential for the Trump administration to designate Venezuela as a state sponsor. When I was asked this, I said, I don't believe this is a good idea. Why did I say that at the time? Because we knew that January 10th, the election or the fraudulent election of Maduro was not going to be recognized. We knew that the Guaido is going to be propelled as the interim president of the country. So I believed putting a state-sponsored designation complicates things. Because this is not just a simple sanction. This is a full-blown designation that has more than just economic effects. It also has diplomatic and visa and other things effects with the country. That I believe that's just something that Guaido didn't need to deal with if his plan was to succeed, if he was able to move to a transition and free and fair elections. So I think timing is important with something like that. Second to that, I do believe that the nature of our pressure strategy, and this goes beyond just the state-sponsored designation. I mean, let's say this Guaido strategy doesn't work, and then we are back to square one, and we want to now pressure the regime even more. Say we were to leverage every sanction, 311, the state-sponsored terror nation. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the premise for all this pressure, right? There's a premise beyond all this. The premise is that the regime, the fundamental nature of the regime is a criminal regime that wants power, controlled by Cuba. That is the premise that you start with. And so you say, okay, if that's the premise, then if we take away all their legitimacy with diplomatic pressure, and we take all their solvency with economic pressure, the regime will fracture. And that's where we're at right now. This is what we're seeing today. Is the regime going to fracture? But my argument is, what if that premise is wrong? What if this is not just a criminal regime that wants power? What if this is a revolution that predates the regime that's looking not just for power, but for conquest and conflict? The Venezuelan regime was propelled off an idea. It wasn't just a bunch of criminals that got together and said, we want to occupy a government. It was propelled on an idea called Greater Colombia or Gran Colombia. It was an aspiration that Hugo Chavez manipulated and took to be able to take the military and manipulate them and get them to believe in this greater concept to be able to launch the revolution. Now, revolutions have end states. And the question is, what's the end state of the Bolivarian Revolution? And I believe that end state is that Greater Colombia, is the capture of foreign territory. They're going to go after Colombia. And after that, they're going to go after Panama, and they're going to go after Ecuador. But they're not going to do it in the conventional sense. They're not going to take tanks and roll them across the borders of Cucuta. They're going to establish networks. And then they're going to use those networks to propel themselves inside those countries. And I just came back from Colombia, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that the Colombian armed forces are concerned about this. If a conflict is to erupt with Venezuela and Colombia, they're not concerned about what's going to happen from Venezuela. They're concerned about what's going to happen from within Colombia, because they believe there are dark networks, clandestine networks already existing in the country that when the conflict erupts, they will rise up and destabilize different parts of their country, similar to what they experienced with the FARC, but even multiplied times 10. So I believe in that sense, our premise has to be, what do we do not just to stop the regime, but what are we going to do to stop this revolution? And from having this revolution destabilize different countries in Latin America, because this is getting beyond just Venezuela.
If I might jump in here?
Yep, please.
If I may. The reason I think we Americans care so much about what is going on in Venezuela is that regime and the allies that it has drawn to it threaten us. They threaten the United States of America with narco-trafficking by Hezbollah, with intelligence and terrorist operations being planned from bases within Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America, by the Iranians, by the IRGC, the Quds Force, with the assistance of the MOIS, and with Hezbollah. We know that once Hezbollah established its base in South America, going back now to the 1980s, to the present time, they didn't stay in South America. They moved northward. And not only were they involved in narco-trafficking, as we know, they were involved in actual terrorist attacks, specifically the 1992 attack against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the 1994 attack against the Jewish Cultural Center in Buenos Aires, and then move on further north to us, because we know that Hezbollah operating out of bases in Latin America, especially out of Venezuela, Margarita Island in the Caribbean, which belongs to Venezuela, is the banking and finance hub for Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere. They moved north. The narco-trafficking moved north. Hezbollah works very closely with the Mexican drug cartels, and they're not just up to our border, they're across our border. We know from open testimony in Congress as long ago as 2003, when George Tenet was then director of CIA, and in open testimony, he was willing to say at that time, 16 years ago, that Hezbollah had then 12 at least, operational cells inside the United States of America. Now, if he's willing to say that in open testimony, what did he say in closed door testimony? How many do they have now? We know from open source news reports of various operations broken up by DEA, FBI, that Hezbollah is very deeply involved, not just in narco-trafficking inside the United States of America, but all kinds of other criminality, to include contraband and fraud and cigarette trafficking and et cetera, et cetera. We also know that the Iranians operating out of that base that was allowed to occur in Venezuela and elsewhere in South America are operating inside the United States too, even though they don't have diplomatic facilities here except for the United Nations. But we know from just a couple of months ago that the FBI broke up, or at least stopped a plot by Iranian operatives to target members of the Iranian opposition, specifically the Mujahideen Khalq and the National Council of Resistance of Iran. We know also that Hezbollah is involved, at the direction and under the control of the Iranians. They're operations officers in the IRGC and the MOIS, Quds Force 2. They are involved in pre-attack casing and surveillance inside the United States against targets that are both American and Israeli and Jewish, Israeli consulates, Israeli other diplomatic facilities, and their diplomats assigned to them. That's why we care so much about Venezuela. It's not only because of what's going on down there and our support for the people of Venezuela and their quest to be free, to gain their liberty, but it's because of the threat that that regime poses to us until it is changed.
Matthew, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, excellent point. I actually just want to build on that a little bit to note that in October 2011, an attempt on the Saudi ambassador in Georgetown, just right down the street here, was interrupted, emanating from south of the border. I mean, that was an attack that was in its, I mean, if you read the open source, was in its final stages of being planned and executed, which could have resulted in casualties. Right? American casualties on the streets of Washington, D.C. So I absolutely agree with that point. It's an excellent point.
So on the topic of border security, Joseph, can you speak to these international actors and their connection to border security in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on what Claire is saying, that these are networks. These networks operate in different countries. They operate in Central America, they operate in South America, and they operate in Mexico. And Venezuela has been a big proliferator of these networks. The regime in Venezuela, first under Chavez, then under Maduro, has provided financing, logistical support, connections, political forums to establish these networks and solidify them in their countries. So I want to take a pivot and put this to a discussion a topic that we discussed in our last event, which is the caravans from Central America. Right? So we've seen this phenomenon kind of erupt since October of last year. We've seen multiple caravans now form in either Honduras or El Salvador and Guatemala and kind of march north. Some reach the border, some don't. But along the way, they cause a lot of problems. They distract security services. They distract the armed services because the militaries have to deal with this in the case of Central America. And then they provide a lot of noise, basically, to border security and the things that the administration is looking on and trying to solidify when it comes to immigration. This was actually said in our last event, and something I want to emphasize here is that this is not a spontaneous event. This isn't just random migrants that decided one day to get up and leave Central America. Look, the conditions in Central America are bad, but they've been bad for a long time. And it wasn't just one day to the next. They all just got up and said, let's get, 10,000 of us and just go to the border. This was orchestrated by political actors, namely planned out of Bolivia, as far as South and South America, and partially financed out of Venezuela, to be able to use immigration as a weapon. And what's that weapon meant to do? It's not meant to actually just get to other countries. Or the purpose of the caravans wasn't to just get into the United States, is actually to cause conflicts along the borders to the United States, including the U.S. southern border. I'm talking about human rights cases, asylum requests, legal cases, and all kinds of different mechanisms to just tie up the border and make the border become a destabilized region, a part where the border is actually blurred. You don't actually see where the border begins and where the border ends, and that's the purpose. And there's a very detailed NGO network that extends from Chicago, Illinois, all the way down to San Pedro Sula, Honduras, extends to Caracas, Venezuela, that is operating this network that's moving these caravans. And so the question that I ask, and what keeps me up at night, is when are the caravans from Central America and the mass migration coming from Central America going to connect with the refugees from Venezuela? Because when that happens, and we're talking about right now, we're at upwards of 3.5 million refugees. When it gets to the numbers that they're talking about, 5 million, 7 million, 8 or 9 million, if you go by the Brookings Institute projections, that is an untenable situation. That is a situation where there's going to be demands by our Latin American partners from throughout the region for the United States to do more, to get more involved, to put more military presence. And I believe that is the strategy. The strategy is to create more refugees so that the United States puts more military presence so that they can use their information operations to delegitimize us throughout the region. This happened with Europe and Syria. It was very much, I mean, if you remember what the Syrian refugee crisis caused for the European governments on immigration policy, it was dramatic. And I think that's very much in the same vein playing itself out here in the Western Hemisphere.
Excellent, thank you. So shifting gears here, we've talked some about Russia, we've talked some about Iran's role. Shifting gears to China now. So Matthew, maybe you could answer this one. The Trump administration has called out China for financially fueling the crisis in Venezuela, and China does hold more than $23 billion in Venezuela's foreign debt. Mike Pompeo said earlier this month in a trip to South America that China and others are being hypocritical for calling for non-intervention in Venezuela's affairs, and called out China's influence for helping, quote, destroy the country. Can you outline some of China's goals in this sort of involvement in Venezuela?
I mean, as far as China's goals, I think they initially saw a target of opportunity and have had substantial investment in Venezuela that they simply can't let go. I think perhaps what we should look at, though, is what tools are available to the administration to further pressure China vis-a-vis Venezuela. Executive Order 13850, the broad executive order dealing with involvement in corruption in Venezuela, which has largely been deployed vis-a-vis Venezuelan actors, is a possible way for them to do so. There was a designation of a Russian bank in mid-March that caught my attention in particular because it was one of the first times that you had this particular authority deployed outside of the Western Hemisphere, and specifically outside, I mean, more importantly, outside of Venezuela, but outside of the Western Hemisphere. I think the administration could stand to utilize this particular tool as a way to show China that it's serious when it comes to Chinese continued intervention and Chinese continued activities related to Venezuela, particularly in the economic realm, particularly as it relates to corruption.
And Joseph, maybe we could follow up with you here. If Maduro is ousted, will China still have such a vast interest in Venezuela? And do you think Juan Guaido would be interested in continuing a relationship with China?
Well, I mean, he wrote an op-ed in Bloomberg, pretty much said that he would be interested in continuing a relationship with China, so that the argument that President Guaido made was that, if they are very interested, if they're legitimately interested in getting paid back for their loans and credits, that transition to power, transition of government would be the only way to do that, because they believe the Maduro regime is not going to be able to pay them back because they don't have the solvency. Now, let me say, I think that's a bit naive, that position by President Guaido, to think that the Chinese government really thought the Venezuelan was going to pay them back, that they did not know, when every market actor in the world knew that Venezuela was an economic basket case, and they kept pouring more money in, that they weren't working off market signals. They were working off different signals, and those signals were more political and geopolitical in nature. China has military ambitions, and we just got to say that out loud. They have military ambitions globally. They have military ambitions in the South China Sea. They have military ambitions in Africa, off the eastern coast of Africa. And they have military ambitions in South America. Let me give you an example. Satellite stations, space, right? We're talking about this launching a new space force here in the United States. And I think one of the reasons we are very rushing to do that is because of China. Because China is actively engaging in a space program that wants to essentially change the way satellites orbit around the prime meridian to be able to control the space domain. And as we know, for those that study warfare, space is the fourth domain of war. So that is an important domain. In Latin America, China controls at least 3 satellite tracking stations. Not satellites, but satellite tracking stations, one of which is in Argentina. The other 2 are in Venezuela and Cuba. And we don't know a lot about these satellite tracking stations. So I can't come here and tell you this is what they do. But I tell you what, I can tell you what we do know. We do know that there's a company, CLTC. It's a state-owned enterprise or state-controlled enterprise that's run by a PLA general. We know that that's the company that controls these satellite facilities. We know that they have not been transparent about the equipment and the personnel that has visited these satellites. And we know that they have hoodwinked various governments in Latin America, particularly the Argentine government, into maintaining those satellite facilities even when the government does not want to. This is a quick little story just to share with you guys. The Argentine government, the new government, Mauricio Macri government in Argentina, when he came into power in Argentina, he wanted to revisit his relationship with China and see, because the previous government signed all these kind of silly deals, not just with China, but with Russia, and the worst was with Iran. So he wanted to revisit all these deals. He looked at the satellite tracking facility and he said, listen, this is not very transparent. We want to have more transparency to it. So he proposed creating a board, a binational board that would oversee the equipment, personnel, and everything that would be related to this facility that's in the southern part of Argentina, in a city called Neuquén in Patagonia in southern Argentina. So he went to China and he said, hey, listen, happy with everything we're doing, happy with all our trade agreements, commercial agreements. I just want to see if we could revisit this one contract and maybe just add, this idea of a board and, make a little more transparency. And China said, yes, absolutely, President Macri, we'd be happy to do this, And as he was leaving, he said, just please check your contract. And so President Macri comes, he's like, what's he talking about? He talks to his foreign ministry, he says, what is he talking about? And the China very cleverly inserted something called a cross-default clause in all of its contracts. What that means is if you renegotiate one contract, you need to renegotiate all your contracts. And that means many contracts in Argentina which are related to infrastructure that are very important to the Argentine government. One particularly is the Belgrano Railway. They can't renegotiate that. They need that project right now, so they're stuck with this military satellite facility that they have no idea what it's doing. General Mattis, when he visited Argentina earlier this year, I believe, or last year, I can't remember, he asked about this very specifically and was, my understanding, not very happy with what he heard. So that's it. And that exists in Venezuela. There's another one of those satellite tracking facilities in Guárico at the Capitan Manuel Rios Air Base in Venezuela.
Thank you. So I just want to take a quick moment to remind our audience to pass their questions to the ends of the rows, and we will go through those. And while we're doing that, Claire, I want to ask you a question going back to the military's role here. The President Trump and his top officials have repeatedly maintained that all options were available in expelling Maduro, including military intervention. The U.S. has since tempered some expectations, but we haven't seen such much progress in Maduro's ousting, specifically from a U.S. role. Could military intervention lead to greater conflicts in this ongoing situation?
You mean greater military involvement by the United States?
Yes, correct.
Yes. Well, certainly, and of course, statements by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, also National Security Advisor John Bolton, as well as the President, President Trump, are certainly not going to get into any kind of details of anything that might be being considered, in the Situation Room, let's say. We're just not going to hear about that. But when they say that all options are on the table, I think what they're getting to is what I was talking about before. This regime in Venezuela is a direct threat to the United States of America. And in that sense, we have the right and the obligation, and our leadership has the obligation, to take the steps necessary to defend this country against that threat. Now, there are various different things that they could do, which would not necessarily and ought not necessarily to be made public, but there are options, as the President alludes to, for different kinds of operations, which might be covert, to lend assistance to the Guaido forces. To this date, though, however, certainly openly, we're not seeing indications of that, but that doesn't mean that that's not happening.
Thank you. So we're going to take one of our first audience questions here. Maybe, Matthew, let's start with you. What examples of VRIC what examples are there of VRIC working together rather than simply being independent actors allied in the support of an anti-American nation?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Of course. So the question here is, what examples are there of VRIC working together rather than simply being independent actors allied in their support of an anti-American nation?
Well, I think one of the most pertinent examples, maybe to take away outside of the Venezuela context, is Syria, where you saw a very close cooperation in efforts to bolster the Assad regime with respect to Iran, with respect to, well, principally with respect to Iran and Russia. Well, Iran and Russia as the principal actors, with China playing at least a secondary role. I mean, those are examples in terms of how within the military context, you've seen a rapid once you see a rapid deterioration in the security framework and the security situation, you do begin to see these types of conflicts pop up. And again, this was a concerted effort on the part of both Russia and Iran to intervene to help the Assad regime at least stabilize and ultimately emerge somewhat victorious out of the civil war.
You know, if I might here to bring it to this hemisphere, one of the prime examples of this alliance certainly has to be the Hezbollah base of operations on Cuba. We know about that thanks to WikiLeaks, remember? So we know very well that the Cuban regime certainly is collaborating with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not an independent actor. It is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranian regime. Both the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and his deputy, Naim Qassem, have both pledged bayat openly to the supreme leader of Iran today, Ali Khamenei. And so you can see that alliance right there among Cuba, certainly, and Iran and Hezbollah, as well as those examples that Matt just gave us, too.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Just there's something that I call the three-quarter standards to understand this alliance and how it manifests itself in Latin America, to go above and beyond just strategic cooperation in terms of their interests or wanting to back up an ally in the international community, which would be Venezuela. The three-quarter standards goes like this: 3/4 of Russia's foreign military sales in Latin America went to 5 countries, right? Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Cuba, and Ecuador. Chinese credits and loans to Latin America went to the same 5 countries. Not investments, but credits and loans went to the same 5 countries. And Iran signed more than 270 bilateral agreements with the same 5 countries. That's a strategy. That's not coincidence, and that's not simply taking just random cooperation because they believe in the values or they believe in an international ally. They have a strategy. That collection of 5 countries has a name. They're called the Bolivarian Alliance, and that Bolivarian Alliance was set up as a surrogate network for those extra-regional actors because they're the ones that propped up that alliance and allowed it to move to be able to offset U.S. influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. So there's a strategic element to this that goes beyond just their bilateral interests. And you could tell that strategic intent by just looking at their transactions.
Thank you. Another question from our audience here. Maybe, Claire, we could start with you, and Joseph, you can build off. What evidence is there of the colectivos being armed?
Really? What? Okay. You could ask Jose Gustavo, I guess. There's plenty of human rights cases that have been documented and presented both to the ICC and the OAS of repression, not just by the regime, but their militias, which are the colectivos. The colectivos have a structure. They're led by the Interior Ministry of Venezuela. And this evidence is in the hands of both the Secretary General of the OAS and members of the European Parliament and other congresses throughout the world. So I don't even know if I would go case by case. I mean, there's plenty of cases of the colectivos have killed civilians in Venezuela and even killed military officers and police officers in Venezuela as well. So that the evidence is abundant on that. I just suggest whoever to read up on those cases for themselves. I'm sorry? What about more recently? More recently? Well, there hasn't been a repression at large scale. I mean, today's really that day that the Venezuelan population is mobilized. The last time was 2017. So 2017 was the last time we had mass mobilization and we had mass repressions and incarcerations and disappearances and detentions. So before that was 2014, before that was 2007. So we have a series of escalations that have happened throughout this. The Insight Crime, which is a good website that actually broke down the structure of the colectivos. I think you could look at their website to get a sense of how they operate and some of the select cases that they've established in Venezuela.
Thank you. And so last question here from our audience. And this one, I believe it would be good for each of our panelists to give a quick answer to this. Do you believe that a self-proclaimed socialist such as Guaido has the potential to displace Nicolas Maduro from power? Matthew, let's start with you.
I'll jump in then. Yes, he does have that ability, that possibility. Does that mean it's going to happen tomorrow? No. Today? No, almost certainly not. Does it mean that he is a unifying figure around whom the Venezuelan people and those who are disaffected within the regime, within the military, can coalesce? Yes, I think he's already proven that. And the fact that Juan Guaido also has been able to garner the expressed official support of something like over 100 countries, governments around the world, the freedom-loving countries, by the way, I think also speaks to his ability to be that leader. He's going to need a lot of support. This is not going to happen overnight. He will need a lot of support and perhaps even external support to make this, to finish the revolution that has begun, to complete the transition for the Venezuelan people. But, the more the people suffer under the consequences of what socialism really means, let's just say Marxism, communism, the more they are going to be disillusioned with any such policies going forward. They can see as well as anybody else where the free market economies of the world, the capitalist economies of the world bring prosperity and opportunity to their people, right there in Latin America, as well as, of course, further north, the United States. They know what socialism has brought to them. So I think they're on a learning curve, if you will, along with perhaps others in the regime. But yes, I do think that Juan Guaido is developing into becoming that leading and unifying figure. We need to stand by him.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and add. So I've been impressed with President Guaido. I did not know him before he announced himself, said that before he was proclaimed as the president of Venezuela. For those that did know him and that talked to me about him, said he was actually a very shy politician. He's very reserved, very quiet. He's an engineer. So I've known engineers, and I know they're not the most vociferous people in the world, and they're very much thinkers. And I kind of could detect by watching his speeches that he is a thinker. He kind of thinks through his answers before he responds. That said, I think Juan Guaido, he's seizing the moment, but he needs to understand what this moment means. He needs to understand that this is beyond just a political element. This is beyond just a fight over political control, that this is a war. And he's going to have to fight this like a war, and he's going to have to understand what warfare is. And within that, he's going to have to get to the root causes of everything. He's going to have to understand that there's root causes to not just what installed itself for the Maduro regime, but what installed itself for the Bolivarian Revolution. Why did the Bolivarian Revolution succeed? Why did it get installed into Venezuela? And within that, he's going to have to articulate values beyond just conditions. He's going to have to articulate values that Venezuela will have to get behind if they want to cure this cancer that is the Maduro regime. And I believe those values have to be encompassed on economic freedom, because that is a slap in the face of what the regime stands for and all their allies. Iran, Russia, China, none of them believe in economic freedom. And as a matter of fact, all of them are ranked among the lowest actors in the world in terms of the indexes of economic freedom. He has to enforce and project sovereignty. This is a challenge of Venezuela's sovereignty. Those actors being invited into Venezuela challenges Venezuela's sovereignty. The refugees pushing out, spilling through the borders challenges Colombia, Brazil's sovereignty. And so he's going to have to stand up for borders, stand up for sovereignty, and stand up for the nation state, the concept of a nation state. And finally, he's going to have to reinforce multidimensional security. Because what the regime tried to make everybody in Venezuela believe is that security is in the hands of the government. The state controls all security, and that the people have to respond to the state. But what he has to redefine is that security is a multidimensional concept that has to do with individual well-being. In the United States, the security is not in the hands of the United States government. Security is in the hands of all of us. Defense is in the hands of the United States government. So he's going to have to redefine those concepts. If he does not redefine these concepts, if he does not stand up for these values, he will fail. And the Venezuelans will pay the consequences.
So a quick follow-up here, in an 11th hour audience question submission. President Trump said in Miami, quote, "The socialism days in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are close to over." How do you think Guaido will help to finish socialism when he is a socialist himself, and why is Guaido hasn't, sorry, my apologies. Let's just stick with, how do you believe that Guaido will help to finish socialism when he is a socialist himself? Joseph, would you like to start?
Yeah, similar to the last question. I mean, at the end of the day, I think whatever he is, I don't know what he is or what he isn't. I know that the Voluntad Popular is part of the International Socialist Alliance. I also know that that's a kind of a weak alliance that has all kinds of fledgling members. So it's not, I wouldn't hang our hat on that. I mean, the International Socialist Alliance is nothing really. So I wouldn't, it's like the Foro Sao Paulo. It's a big boogeyman that really means nothing. And the networks that are established in Venezuela, the networks that are established in Latin America, they're more powerful than these other political actors or political alliances that we're talking about. But it just goes back to the same answer I said. I mean, Juan Guaido, whatever he was yesterday, doesn't have to be what he is tomorrow. And he's going to have to define that as a man. He's going to have to define that as a president. And he's going to have to define that as a leader of the Venezuelan people. Because Venezuela doesn't need a president. They don't need a politician. Venezuela needs a leader. And it needs a leader that's going to take them to victory using all the elements of asymmetric war to beat an adversary that's very formidable, which is this BRIC alliance.
Thank you. Claire, would you like to follow up?
Sure. I think the thing to note is that every single place in the entire world, in the history of the world, that socialism, Marxism, communism has been tried, it has failed the people. The regime in Iran, the regime in Russia, the regime in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, they are only in power because they're kept in power by the brute force of terror and guns. Socialism fails people. The people realize this. As the Venezuelan people are standing up for their own liberty right now, I think the lesson cannot be lost on them how they got to this place. They know that they're oil wealthy. They know their country is full of all kinds of resources, mineral resources, agricultural resources, water resources, as well as oil and gas resources. They know that, and they know that they've been reduced to a state of utter poverty without food. They're foraging for food in the garbage cans. There's no formula for the babies. There's no diapers for the babies. They know how they got there, and they can look at the other countries of this hemisphere and in the world where free market capitalism leads to a completely different outcome. So even as Juan Guaido himself may be growing into the role that he is as new leader of Venezuela, I think the people of Venezuela themselves too are also growing and learning what it means to be a free people. It means that not just you are blessed with individual liberty and a government by consent of the governed, it means that they have to become citizens. They're not just vassals and serfs anymore. And they have to realize that themselves too, that their role has to be to step up as informed and now engaged citizens, not just engaged on the streets as they take to the streets rightfully to secure their liberty, but afterwards to become actual citizens of a state with those things, of those first things principles, as we call them here, of individual liberty, government by consent of the governed, equality for all before the rule of law. Those are things the Venezuelan people are going to have to learn and grow into as well, but they know perfectly well what doesn't work. And there are many like the United States who will stand by them to help them as they move into a new phase of their own country and their own agency as citizens. So I think that would be my hope for the people as things move forward.
Thank you. We have just about one more minute here. Matthew, would you like to give us any final thoughts?
Well, just to follow up on my colleague's last thought, it's also incumbent that the United States and its allies in this effort help sketch out an economic vision. I mean, this is the constant problem you run into with respect to heavily sanctioned jurisdictions in which there is no commensurate economic vision. It's consistently a liability construct without the incentive. And the administration needs to build out and to describe what the incentive structure looks like going forward in the event of the transition of power in Venezuela. And this includes in the immediate term, in the medium term, and in the long term. But that vision and specifics on how they would help the Guaidó government implement that vision is absolutely critical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, Joseph, Claire, and Matthew, and thank you to SFS. I'll give it back to you, JD.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was a fabulous panel. So much appreciate what you've done, Lauren, today, Joseph, Matt, and Claire, to share your expertise with us on what's going on in Venezuela and the VRIC more broadly. It was also fabulous to have Senator Grassley and Senator Cruz join us today, considering how they signed that letter to the State Department regarding Venezuela. There are two true leaders in the Senate as far as ensuring that the U.S. has smart policy towards Venezuela and how to resolve the situation down there. So it was a real honor to have them here today. Thanks very much to E.J. Kimball, my colleague, for making sure that happened today, to have Senator Grassley and Senator Cruz with us. Thank you very much also to Kylie Scrope, our program manager, and to Christina and Allison for helping make today a great success. Thank you for coming today, for our friends and colleagues visiting from places like Argentina and from Venezuela, Colombia. A number of folks made a great effort to get here today. Thanks so much, right, for our friends in the media, Georgia. Thanks so much for our friends in the media for coming today as well. Our next event is going to be in June, and it's going to be about the 25th anniversary of the AMIA terror attack in Argentina. The Cultural Center was attacked there in 1994. It was the largest Islamist terror attack in the Western Hemisphere up until 9/11. The center has done a lot of work and a lot of research papers. Joseph has been down to Argentina many times. He's worked with a lot of different members of Congress and civil society leaders in Argentina to bring to light what happened and Iran's role in the AMIA bombing. And so join us in June. The date is TBD, but we'll have an event around the 25th anniversary of that horrific attack. Please do follow us on Twitter @SecureFreeSoc. Like us on Facebook. Like us on Facebook and follow on Facebook too if you can. And if you're not already on our email distribution list, please see Kylie and she'd be glad to add you. And last but not least, again, our VRIC monitor, which was the reason for our event today. Kylie says that another one's going to come out in a week or so, so be on the lookout for that. And please do support our work and keep coming to our events. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.